Am I challenged by the abuse stories that we're hearing? Am I challenged by these pretty searing narratives that we're getting of people who are saying that they were damaged by what they experienced? And I would say yes, up to a point. If people are going to be willingly engaged in a sexual encounter and feel quite happy about it at the time, and for it genuinely to be a willing engagement at the time and a happy engagement, and then a decade or more later, when they've learned about how unacceptable all this is, a lot of people begin to internalize the social narrative that, oh my God, that what happened to me, everybody's saying it was abusive. And a lot of people do believe then that it must have been abusive. And they then begin to explain to themselves all sorts of things that have gone on in their lives afterwards, like drug abuse and, alcoholism. Anything that goes wrong, they'll explain it on this early abuse. In many cases, however, I would point out what is often obscured is that in a lot of these instances, you have people who had personality problems and difficulties before ever the relationship, before ever they were involved in it. For instance, there are some teachers who've had contact with kids at children's homes where they've been in those homes because initially they were in trouble with the law, their behaviour was bad, and very often they will have come from abusive homes where they've encountered violence at the parental level and violently dysfunctional households. Now, these people are very often extremely reluctant to blame their parents for anything. Their parents are supposed to be, people you're proud of. And it's much easier to blame the pedophile you had a later relationship with. So a lot of this is somewhat bogus, I have to say. Some of it, though, is genuine, and this causes me a problem. Like, for instance, I was particularly touched by the Caldecott Boys' School case. And it occurs to me that there was real abuse there. There was real, and despite it seeming, no doubt to the teachers who were involved, consensual at the time, it wasn't really. The kids had no choice. And I can understand why those particular boys would grow up feeling traumatized. All of these people can't be wrong. And so I have to take on board where they may be right. So what my response to that would be was, well, if I'm a bad pedophile or if people like me are bad, let's do something about it. We can't eliminate the feelings, but I feel the attempt by society to eliminate all expression of these feelings is taking society in a terrible direction. We need to do something in between. What we need to do is something along the lines of empowerment as feminists would see it. We need a society with greater accountability. What we have in something like the Caldecott School is a traditional setup from years ago where teachers had tremendous amount of power and parents were not expected to have any say in all of this. Kids were expected to have the stiff upper lip and just do what they were told by the masters. I think we need to get away from that. But that doesn't mean to say we have to eliminate all sexual expression. I think we need to rethink our institutions. We need to rethink accountability for our actions. So I'm not throwing the best insights of feminist thought out. We need to retain the best of feminist thinking. And I think the best of pedophilic feelings could also be expressed, and space ought to be found for this kind of intimacy, as it was in ancient Greece with pedagogic pederasty, where there was an institutionally accepted form of pederasty, which worked well for 1,000 years or more. So I'm not saying we can go back to those times, which also included total male dominance over females, but we need to look at those case histories and learn from them as we go into the future. Power relationships are important and intrinsically problematic, not just in relationships between pedophiles and children, but there it's a particular matter of public concern at the moment, but in all adult-child relationships. With a mother and her baby, we have a total disparity in power. The mother is essentially extremely powerful. The baby has no power. Well, according to some feminist theory, such relationships ought not to be allowed because there's too much power. The adult has too much power. Women must not be allowed to have control of babies unless they're under total supervision at all times. You can get a very challenging situation in which you have to decide which has the more power. One is disadvantaged in one way and one is disadvantaged in another way. And does the relationship, if there's a lot of power disparity between adults, make it legitimate so that you forbid it? Or do you do something else? Do you change the conditions in which the power operates so that there can be more say for the disadvantaged party in terms of power? And that's why I would want to see open relationships rather than closed situations, as in the Caldecott school situation. Where it's all going at the moment, it looks pretty grim, because we're getting more and more oppressive society. There's more and more surveillance. Everybody is watched to a much greater extent than used to be the case. And systems of surveillance and control are getting ever greater. And privacy, personal privacy, is getting ever less and kind of eliminates much space for trust in society. So we're losing, and freedom. We're losing a lot of trust and freedom. And these things are quite precious. It would be hard, in my view, to think of a more oppressed class than paedophiles in Britain today. I mean, I can't name any group that can claim to be a more oppressed minority. Just see it everywhere. Paedophiles are being jailed and hounded wherever. Well, I don't feel it's justified. I don't feel that the best is being made of people's feelings towards children. I think all the negatives are being seen and none of the positives. And I think at some point that has to change, because society is on a downward spiral of mistrust, which is poisoning the situation of all children, especially as children themselves are becoming more criminalised if they have sexual relations with themselves. So that affects all children, potentially, not just people like myself who are attracted to children sexually. There is no evidence at all that there has been an increase in paedophilia in recent years. None whatever. So that means that there's some explaining that needs to be done as to why it's become the focus of so much public concern. The roots of this lie very, very deep, in my view, and they engage economics, technology, history at all levels. I think that in the last couple of 100 years, what we've seen is the emergence, first of all, of what we might call the nuclear family, limited family, whereas before, people living in villages, typically agricultural, and before that hunter-gatherers back in distant time, had a greater sense of community and engagement, and everybody know everybody else. And lots of people would be involved in the upbringing of the child. And even as Hillary Clinton famously said, it takes a village to raise a child. And ideally, that's the way we would be. But economics dictated, in the Industrial Revolution particularly, that families got smaller and smaller and smaller because labour needed to be more mobile. And so people became factory fodder, essentially. And the family unit became mother and father, and typically a lot of children at one time, fewer now. But it was the nuclear family, not the wider community. That created in itself a lot of neuroses and tensions because people didn't have the wider community to draw upon to deal with their psychological problems, and made a lot of families dysfunctional. So, there's no accident that divorce has begun to rise, that people marry less now because they feel it necessary to follow love relationships. And this in itself creates a lot of guilt because you have more what used to be called broken families. And you have more children suffering from divorce and separation. And a lot of parents, I'm sure, feel quite guilty about the effects that this is having on their kids. And so they have to displace these feelings onto something else. And it's very convenient to have the scapegoat of the pedophile. As the nuclear family, we're getting the splitting of the nucleus, basically. This is what it's coming down to. The nuclear family is exploding. We've seen it decade by decade. Fewer and fewer marriages, more and more separations, more and more tensions, displacement. We've got pedophilia as a convenient scapegoat.